So you are the CEO and co-founder of Taipy, which is an open source Python platform. It's a data-driven web application builder. Can you elaborate for us on what Taipy does?
Okay, so let me give you a bit of perspective. I've worked for many years building application in the AI world for large companies. We have done that for companies like the container terminals in Singapore, companies in the semiconductor business like Samsung, TSMC, and McDonald's, and so on and so forth. Disney for manpower planning and so on. So large companies. We have done that for a long time in Java, Scala, earlier on C++. And these were heavy projects. And we really wanted to do that in Python. Everything. I mean, from all the different functions, front end, back end. And since we loved Python, we said, well, let's do that. And we realized there were some issues. One on the back end first, for the kind of application we had in mind, which are mostly AI application with end users, right? End users using the software, smart or not so smart software, but there is a graphical interface, which is very important here. So on the graphical side, we were not happy with what Python was proposing in its ecosystem in those days, a few years back. We looked at several software, and we couldn't find what we needed in terms of having a powerful graphical interface builder where you can really design easily, graphics, charts, and pages, a lot of interactions, having it multi-user, and so on, and easy to use. That's the important thing. We wanted any Python developer to be able to develop graphical interfaces. The second component was on the back end. As you know, software are not only about user interfaces, it's also about the back end. And we looked around, and there were tools in the Python ecosystem also, but we found them either extremely complex, or for what we wanted, we would need like 3 or 4 of these packages. So we decided to build really Taipy around these two packages, Taipy GUI and Taipy Core. That's how it started. This is the origin of the product.
Right. So these two. Can we call them two separate products, GUI and Core?
So initially, they have been designed as two separate packages. So when you do a pip install Taipy, for instance, you do get both package if you want, and you can use one or the other. There is no connections, if you want, between them. But this is not what will happen soon. In the next release, we are going to link the two. For instance, the graphical components are basically built on top of Plotly, and this is really an augmented markdown capability that we provide to really build quickly these interfaces. On the back end, we do provide pipelines. We have a great pipeline editor. We're the only tool to provide this functionality of quickly building graphically your pipeline, not only with styles, but also data node. The data is modeled on all the flows and so on. And we have this concept, a very important concept called scenarios. Scenarios are really about being able to run your pipelines with different parameters and to keep these runs, these executions, and be able to compare them. You can compare two scenarios. You can compare them over time. But in the next release, what we want is these two components to come together. So you will be able to graphically see all the scenarios, for instance, that have occurred in the past 2 weeks, and select them and visualize the data node automatically. And all of this is like a single graphical component that visualize your backend component. So this is where we are going, and that will be available in June for our next release.
Nice. That sounds really exciting. So I understand the GUI component. seems very easy for me to understand. The Taipei GUI component, it's difficult, or it historically was difficult to build graphical interfaces easily in Python. And so Taipei GUI offers this solution. For Taipei Core, could you elaborate for me a bit more on what the problem was and how Taipei Core is a solution? So you were talking about having to use 3 or 4 different applications previously to achieve the same objective, but maybe giving us a specific use case of the way that things were before Taipei Core, and now how that same endpoint can be reached much more easily with Taipei Core.
Sure. So the first thing is Taipei is all about pipelines, on building pipelines. And our objective is not only to cater for the needs of people who are already building pipelines, but we want also to bring people who are not using pipelines to use pipelines. Pipeline is also a kind of methodology to build your algorithms. We are still seeing a lot of Python developers, involved with some kind of spaghetti programming, and which should be solved with pipelines. For instance, in pipelines, in Taipei Core, you can, for instance, do caching. So if one of your tasks have not changed, or the input have not changed, there's no reason to run it again. So pipelines bring a lot of facility for doing that. The other aspect that you have is also to make sure this corresponds to best practices when you build your pipelines. For instance, in machine learning, you really have to build your main algorithm, but you need to have what is called forgot the names, like having the canary in the mine, where you can have a second or third algorithms to compare with. So there are a few things relating to this. So first, again, it's all about the ease to build these pipelines. We don't want people to be struggling to build a simple or complex pipelines. Hence, this graphical editor, which is an extension of Visual Code, and allows anybody really to build pipelines where you have predefined data nodes that can read external data. Data node can be even your own parameter, a Python object that gets modified through the graphical interface, for instance. And you produce output data node. The task will do that. And this output data node will have to be stored and kept and so on. And the thing that we couldn't find are really the concept of scenario. A scenario is really, in the world of machine learning, they refer to experiment, I suppose. But we want to go way beyond just the realm of data science here. We want to look at the complete application. So in that sense, most of the algorithm will end up in the hands of end users, where you have graphics and they will be using your pipelines, and they will be modifying these pipelines. How? By parameters. We have an example, for instance, for Intermarché, one of the largest retailer in Europe. When you deal with projections for the stores or the cash flow for the whole company, the COVID data is actually something that no one had any data. So it was really data that only the end user could inject in the pipelines to really look at different kinds of scenarios. So this capability to build scenario is something really unique. We couldn't find this anywhere in any of the existing tools. And that's the heart of Taipei Core. And if you look at the other software, so of course there are software packages like Airflow, for instance. So Airflow is really covering some of what we are doing, but it's quite complicated. There is a big learning curve involved. There are some other tools like, for instance, Prefect, for instance, which is a nice software, but it's lacking also this great editor. There's no concept free of scenarios and this kind of thing. So again, it's all about having the capability to build easily these pipelines to track every single run, to be able to consider things like business cycles. So that's from our background. We come from we work with big companies. So when you work for McDonald's, for instance, and you do a forecast for each of their stores, every week they need to produce a forecast. So it's kind of weekly cycle. For another situation, it could be a monthly cycle or daily cycle. So all your scenarios you run needs to be sorted per bucket, time bucket, a week, a day, a month, whatever. So all of this is kind of pre-built, and again, really easy to use to come up with your backend.
Nice. Okay, so to try to summarize back for you, what I now think I understand really well about this product, about this component of Taipei. So the core component allows you to build pipelines easily. So even people who haven't felt like they could do pipelining before, they can now understand this great way of organizing your project so you don't have, as you described it, spaghetti code linking everything together. So you can have clearly defined nodes, clearly defined data flows into and out of your analytics processes, your machine learning models, maybe some combination of those things, because you could have some data inflowing, then some pre-processing steps, then maybe it goes through a machine learning model and then flows into some analytics so that a report can be created, say, on a daily cadence or a weekly cadence. And that whole flow can be captured as a well organized scenario.
Absolutely. And for us, we consider that we have two kind of users. So the data scientist can also program, of course, all this, but he's also a user. He can also build a graphical interface for his own pipeline and use that.
A click
But
and point user.
exactly, and you have, of course, the end user, the person who doesn't know how to program in Python will be using this, but he also needs to run these scenarios to do some variation, to start a forecast with different values. For instance, the parameter for the forecast could be the date from which you want to start the forecast. You may try to want different values. So all of these are also scenarios.
Right. So you could potentially have a Python developer, a data scientist who is programming up a TypeI core scenario, and then an end user at a specific McDonald's location could take that scenario and rerun it on a different day of the week or with some different kind of input parameter.
Exactly, and thus creating more scenarios. And usually at the end of the day, he will pick one of these scenario as an end user and say, that's the
Right.
scenario that I want to be published, to be official.
Right. Right. Cool. All right. Now I understand. That sounds great. Um, and then coming up in June, and I think we'll talk about this more later in the episode, these two different key components of the TypeI software library, this open source library TypeI. So we historically had the GUI part and the core part being separate, but coming up soon, those will be blended together. And so, for example, you'll be able to do things like being able to visualize um, in the GUI component the way that your data flows are set up within core.
Yeah, so basically, data flows are quite simple. You model the data. This is modeled as data nodes and tasks. And that makes your pipeline. So yeah, and you can have several pipelines modeled. Um, and this will be run. Each run will happen with different values of your parameters, and this is what we call scenarios. So basically, it's four concepts: data nodes, tasks, pipelines, and scenarios. All of this can be visualized. So if I select a scenario, I want to know, what are the data nodes, what data is inside each data node. So you can have really like graphically, you can have a selector of scenarios. So automatically, you have all your scenarios appearing. You can select one, and it will show up. What are the data nodes and you can click on one of these data nodes and have a view as a table, as a chart or charts of that data. So all of this will be kind of ready to use within the graphical Taipy graphical objects, where you can not only visualize your own stuff, but also the backend itself. So that will make the programming and the development of the full application even faster. So
Nice.
you bring basically the two elements together.
And to dig into those, so we've talked about scenarios a fair bit now. To dig into the data nodes and the tasks a little bit more, I'm kind of getting the impression, and you can correct me on what I'm getting right, what I'm getting wrong about these, but maybe the data nodes, these are like the data structures. So it's like it could be a table of data, whereas the tasks, these do work. These are more like the verbs. So like the data nodes are like the nouns, and the tasks are like the verbs doing work on those nouns.
Yes, exactly. And to be even more concrete, data nodes, they are predefined data nodes, a CSV data node, a JSON data node, a Parquet data node, and so on. A data node may not only be a pointer to some external data, it could be also a Python object, like a date that is entered through your graphical interface. That's also a data node.
Right.
And you have the output data nodes, which are created by your tasks. So the tasks take as input the input data node, and as output the
Right.
output data node. And the output data node, will actually store the data for if inside each scenario. So these are data generated and kept by Taipy core. And the task is purely a Python function.
Right.
So it fits very well within your IDE, whatever IDE you're using. One thing I want to say also is that we made also a big point to make sure that Taipy was working, not only as a .py or IDE environment, but also within notebooks. So we
Nice.
are I think we are the only, for instance, interface, full web application graphics that you can trigger from a notebook.
That's great to hear because that is often a nightmare. Like I've tried lots of different kinds of visualizations, particularly if you're trying to get a visualization outside of the specific browser tab that you're in a Jupyter
Exactly,
notebook.
exactly.
It can be an absolute nightmare. So that's great to hear.
Yeah, that was, I had to convince our R&D team that on day one we had a fairly strong argument on this, and I won. I'm happy to have won.